The birthday banquet turned out to be amazing. Aside from Cedric Ironhill, everyone from our class had attended. Not making an appearance at the party could only mean one of two things. Either House Ironhill held some grievance against House Balatoa, or something truly urgent had happened. Personally, I leaned toward the first option. As custom dictated, gifts were opened the moment they were presented. Before long, an entire table had disappeared beneath neatly wrapped packages. There was a lovely pair of ballroom shoes, a beautifully crafted box filled with cosmetics, another containing elegant Pokémon accessories, books, jewelry, and enough embroidered handkerchiefs to supply a small army of noble ladies. Then came Olivia. Again, she somehow managed to outdo herself. Her gift was an entire carriage, handcrafted from prime redwood and fitted with an ingenious suspension system to make traveling considerably smoother. Even the polished harness had been designed to be pulled by up to 4 Pokémon. I honestly had no idea where she kept finding these absurd presents. Augustin, meanwhile, had prepared something much more practical. His gift was an enchanted defensive ring. If Ventis's mind entered a state of panic or overwhelming fear, the enchantment would automatically raise a magical barrier around her. Now that was a gift I could appreciate. As classmates, Pokémon, servants, and nobles mingled throughout the gardens, the remaining guests finally began arriving. Peliane! Ventis completely abandoned her carefully practiced noble composure the moment her former master stepped out of the carriage. She hurried over and embraced her tightly. "I'm so happy you made it. I wouldn't have missed this for anything." Peliane laughed warmly as she hugged her back. "Well?" came another familiar voice. Count Alderic E. Velna stepped down from the carriage behind her. "You've barely been gone half a year, yet all I see before me is a proper noble lady instead of the young mage who left our estate." He chuckled softly. For some reason, he looked years younger than I remembered. Many of the deep worry lines that had once marked his face had faded, leaving behind a far more relaxed expression. Their presents were thoughtful rather than extravagant. Peliane had commissioned a beautifully bound journal filled with thick, perfectly bleached white pages worthy of an archmage's library. The Count presented Ventis with a bronze sculpture depicting the two of us standing proudly side by side. The craftsmanship was incredible. Every fold of my hat, every strand of Ventis's hair, even my wand had been recreated in astonishing detail. Then Alderic turned toward me. "I believe this letter belongs to you, Miss Fenn." He smiled warmly as he held out a neatly folded envelope. "Breaks?" I accepted it. The moment it reached my paws, my nose twitched. The overly sweet perfume soaked into the paper immediately told me who had written it. With a small smirk, I broke the pink wax seal. "Dear Fenn, I cannot express how sorry I am for the way I treated both you and Ventis. I now realize that I was never worthy of having you as my Pokémon. Your suggestion truly bore fruit." Eevee evolved into a previously unknown form. She is so lovely that I can barely put it into words. Please, if you ever visit the Evelna Manor again, I would love for you to come and play with us. Please tell Ventis that I have changed, and that I respect her as well. Sincerely, Esther Evelna. "Well?" the Count asked after I finished reading. I simply smiled. Then I folded the letter with great care and tucked it safely into the fluffy fur of my tail. The next arrival was not what I expected. Archmage Gehatu Cavelis arrived dressed far more like a noble than a mage, riding atop his majestic Salamence, who landed gracefully beside the waiting carriages. Instead of simply jumping down, the old mage was helped by his faithful Scyther, who respectfully lowered one bladed arm after another, allowing Gehatu to use them as makeshift steps. Even like this, he radiated authority. His focus wasn't a wand, but an ancient-looking book that floated effortlessly beside his hip. Several enchanted rings adorned his fingers, each carrying a different magical aura, and the sheer density of mana surrounding him was enough that both Ventis and I could feel it pressing against our senses. Of course, I had sensed some of it while flying back with him after my kidnapping, But back then he had been exhausted, running on potions and determination. Compared to now, he had seemed almost empty. This was an archmage at full strength. Archmage Gehatu, sir. Ventis bowed deeply. I am honored by your presence. Nonsense, Lady Ventis. Gehatu chuckled warmly. It is I who am touched by your invitation. I have rather significant plans for your future, so I welcome any opportunity to speak with you beyond a few passing words here and there. He extended a hand toward her with a smile. Now, lend an old man a hand. My bones are not nearly as spry as they used to be. It was a complete lie. I could tell from the way his manner flowed that he didn't need help in the slightest. He simply wanted an excuse to speak with Ventis privately while walking. I just rolled my eyes. So, Gehatu glanced toward the pool with an amused smile. I see you've managed to tame Primarina. I remember having quite a difficult time with that water type. Well, Ventis couldn't suppress a chuckle. To be fair, it was Fenn who beat her into submission. She smiled toward the elegant sea lion. She's become a wonderful Pokémon since then. Having overheard the conversation, Primarina gracefully emerged from the pool and held her head as high as possible, looking every bit the noble lady she believed herself to be. Well, that's all for the better. Gehatu nodded approvingly. As for those plans I mentioned, his expression became noticeably more serious. I hope you've realized by now that you possess everything needed to become an archmage. Your spell work is already comparable to that of an experienced war mage. Your control is exceptional, and while your mana reserves still have room to grow with age, that will come naturally. The old mage continued speaking, and continued, and continued. After a few minutes, I came to the conclusion that Archmage Gehatu simply didn't possess an off switch. I quietly tuned him out. There were far more important things to do, like finding the other Pokémon and enjoying the birthday party myself. Prince Calith sat in his private office when a peasant, dressed in little more than rags, was escorted inside. The man looked utterly exhausted. His bare feet were covered in sores, and every limping step suggested he had walked for weeks without proper rest. Carefully removing his threadbare hat, he reached into its worn folds and produced a sealed letter. Baron Eldric Malvor sent me across the border to deliver this, Your Highness. Hope shone brightly in the man's tired eyes. He said I would be rewarded handsomely. Of course. Calith smiled pleasantly as he unclipped a richly decorated coin purse from his belt and tossed it to the messenger. Your service is appreciated. The peasant nearly stumbled catching it. Feeling the heavy weight of gold inside, a broad grin spread across his face. Thank you, Your Highness. He bowed repeatedly before hurrying from the room. The moment he stepped outside, a sharp gust of air swept through the hallway. His smile disappeared, and a heartbeat later his head rolled across the polished stone floor. The guard calmly wiped his sword clean, retrieved the untouched purse, dusted it off, and carried it back into the office. My lord, he said with a respectful bow, I witnessed a peasant attempting to flee with your gold, so I dealt with the thief. Of course. Calith nodded, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. The guard quietly withdrew, already directing servants to clean the corridor. Only then did Calith unfold the parchment. His eyes moved steadily down the page. By the 6th line, his fingers had creased the edges, and the pleasant smile had completely vanished. Prince Calith prided himself on possessing an analytical mind. Very little could truly anger him, and even on his worst days he refused to act rashly. This letter, however, made his blood boil. Jal Shara was a proud kingdom whose traditions stood as firm as granite itself. The mere existence of a Bracian outside their borders was already an insult to the royal bloodline. To learn that this very Bracian had formed a soul bond with a Vermont mage living under King Callister's protection felt like someone had spat directly into his family's face. A loud rip echoed through the office. Only then did Calith notice he had torn the parchment cleanly in half. Closing his eyes, he took several slow, measured breaths before carefully laying both pieces back onto the desk. Looking down at his hand, he saw deep, red crescent marks where his fingernails had dug into his palm. This was terrible. Absolutely unforgivable. Yet, slowly, his anger cooled, replaced by calculation. He could use this. War had already been brewing beneath the surface. Ever since the last conflict, Zhao Shara had deliberately projected weakness. Rumors of unrest, rebellious nobles, and dwindling military strength had all been carefully planted across the border, encouraging Vermont to lower its guard. The truth couldn't have been more different. His brother, King Ragus, had spent years quietly rebuilding Zhao Shara's strength, preparing to seize a massive portion of Vermont when the time was right. The original plan had been simple: stage a border incident, blame Vermont, and march to war. Now fate had delivered them something far better: a stolen royal Pokémon, a Brazian serving a foreign mage, a justification no citizen of Zhao Shara would dare question. And amidst the chaos of war, he might even reclaim both the Brazian and the girl bonded to her. Calith rose from his chair, his pace calm but purposeful. Anyone who knew him would immediately recognize that his temper had not truly settled. He headed directly toward the royal breeding grounds. A certain detachment of guards was about to experience the worst day of their military careers. After all, allowing a Fennekin of the royal bloodline to disappear beneath their very noses was not the sort of mistake one simply apologized for. With the royal protection and the obvious looming shadow of the Archmage watching over us, there were no more troubles. The end of the academy year arrived with the season's first snowfall, and Ventis was busy packing to return south for the winter break. So, I spoke into her mind, 3 months of freedom, huh? Ventis rolled her shoulders as she slipped into the comfortable mage's robe Pelien had given her. It was still a little too large, but lately she'd been going through a noticeable growth spurt. I am done with all that noble posturing, she sighed. Sadly, we're not going back to the Evielna Manor just yet. Huh? Why? I asked. That had been the plan. Don't worry, Fenn. Ventis shook her head. It's just Robert. We're going to the Marquis's Manor in the north for 2 weeks. She lazily waved a hand while folding another set of clothes into her trunk. It's the whole welcome to the family thing. Since I'm officially a Balatoa now, it's expected that I visit the family's ancestral home. Honestly, going north in winter isn't exactly my preferred idea either. The unpassable mountains are wicked enough during summer. Mountains? Terence suddenly poked his head through the doorway. His reaction reminded me of an excited dog hearing someone mention squirrels, and I couldn't help snickering. Well, yeah. We're going north, Terence, Ventis said, shaking her head at just how single-minded the boy could be. Terence pumped a fist into the air. Yes? Then he hurried off to continue packing. I should probably do my own packing too, I sighed as I walked into my room. My tail fluff was amazingly spacious, capable of holding several small and medium-sized objects without anything falling out. It was practically a storage pouch. Even so, I'd somehow managed to accumulate a respectable pile of accessories over the past months. Oh, Arceus. I stared at everything spread neatly across my bed. I've completely become a girl. Decorative ribbons, hair bows, a dozen little accessories for my witch hat. I had more than I could realistically wear. Well, I mean, I am one. Shaking my head, I packed everything into a sturdy suitcase instead. About an hour later, all our luggage had been secured to the back and roof of the carriage. I loved our new ride. The seats were wide and unbelievably soft, making long journeys far more comfortable than the old carriage ever could. Of course, using it had also meant purchasing 2 new Mudsdales to pull it. We had briefly considered Rapidash since they were considerably cheaper, but the northern roads were rough, especially during winter, and Mudsdale were built for exactly that sort of terrain. Each had cost 50 gold shillings, but at least they were healthy, well-trained, and strong enough to pull the heavily loaded carriage without complaint. Higher! The coachman snapped the reins, and the Mudsdale leaned into their harnesses. Beside us rode Commander Lewis Tide atop his own Rapidash, while his Feraligatr rested inside the crystal Pokeball Ventis had lent him for the journey. The carriage behind ours carried Terence, along with Magmar and Geodude. Standing by the manor gates, Zelia and Reginald waved us goodbye. We waved back as the student manor slowly disappeared behind us, leaving the capital and the academy behind for the winter. We passed several small towns, villages, and tiny hamlets as the road steadily climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew noticeably colder, and patches of snow lingered wherever the sun failed to reach. Pine forests blanketed the lower slopes, their dark green crowns contrasting beautifully against the white dusting covering the ground. Eventually, I leaned halfway out of the carriage window. Oh! I had read about the Balatoa family's seat before, but words on paper had done it no justice. The castle wasn't merely impressive. It was a fortress built to withstand an army. The entire structure had been carved directly into the sheer face of Blackened Peak, the tallest mountain for miles around. Its dark grey stone rose like a giant spear toward the winter sky, almost black in places where centuries of wind and snow had polished the rock smooth. The castle itself had been built from a slightly paler stone, making its towers, battlements, and countless arrow slits stand out against the mountain behind them. Rather than sitting atop the peak, it became part of it, as though the mountain itself had grown walls. The approach was just as intimidating. A massive gatehouse guarded the only road upward, while thick curtain walls zigzagged along the mountainside, forcing any attacker to pass through several narrow choke points before ever reaching the main keep. Nestled beneath the fortress was Blackhall, the town belonging to House Balatoa. Unlike the sprawling capital, Blackhall had grown wherever the mountain allowed it. Narrow stone streets wound between sturdy buildings, with steep roofs built to shed heavy snow. Smoke lazily curled from hundreds of chimneys, carrying the comforting scent of burning pinewood across the valley. Workshops rang with the sounds of hammers striking steel, while merchants hurried through the streets before the afternoon chill settled in. Encircling the settlement stood another wall, this one built from the same nearly black stone as the mountain itself. Watchtowers overlooked every approach, their guards bundled in thick cloaks against the cold. Above the walls snapped the black and blue banners of House Balatoa. At their center stood the family's proud sigil, a mighty Raiden. Its horn pointed toward the sky, like a challenge to anyone foolish enough to march on Blackhall. I slowly pulled my head back inside the carriage. Yeah, I looked at Ventis. I suddenly understand why nobody has ever conquered this place. It is intimidating, unlike the Marquis and his family. Ventis shook her head in amazement. How can such a harsh place produce people with that much charm and joy? As our carriage passed beneath the final gate and entered the castle grounds, everything suddenly felt different. The biting mountain wind simply vanished. The air became pleasantly warm, and instead of snow-covered stone, we found ourselves rolling through an enormous inner garden. Flower beds burst with color despite the middle of winter. Neatly trimmed hedges lined the road, while fruit trees and flowering bushes grew as though it were late spring rather than the coldest season of the year. What? I gawked at a field of blooming flowers beside the road. How? Look. Ventis pointed toward several carved stone pillars scattered along the road and nestled between the garden beds. Those are enchanted stones. I'd bet half my money they're generating heat. So it's a flex. I chuckled. Like, look how loaded we are. We can afford to have several mages constantly filling enchanted stones just so our garden stays pretty during a blizzard. Ventis looked at me for a moment before nodding thoughtfully. Well, doesn't every noble house flex in some way? Even House Evielna showed off their famous Eevee breeding. I nodded before another thought crossed my mind. What was Baron Malvor flexing with back at Hagsrod? His Venusaur. Ventis answered with a sour expression. TSK. Lame. I snickered, just as the carriage rolled to a gentle stop. Robert was already waiting for us at the foot of the manor steps. Beside him stood Bishop at perfect attention, while behind them 17 knights formed 2 immaculate lines. Their captain stepped forward and saluted the moment our carriage came to a halt. "We greet Lady Ventis Balatoa." The knights' voices thundered together, echoing across the courtyard. Commander Lewis climbed down from his rapidash and gave an appreciative nod before handing the reins to a stable boy. Robert stepped forward and offered his hand. Ventis accepted it gracefully as she descended from the carriage. "Hi, Robert," she smiled. The moment their eyes met, I felt that emotion again. Warm, gentle, hopelessly romantic. It made every hair on my body try to stand on end. Actual love. I immediately shrank our soul bond to the bare minimum. There was no way I wanted to experience the swarm of butterflies currently dive-bombing Ventis's stomach. "Welcome home, my dear wife." Robert smiled softly before giving her a gentle kiss on the cheek. I was this close to shouting into Ventis's mind to get a room. But, as a refined young lady, I somehow managed to restrain myself. Despite how rigid and cold the castle looked from the outside, its interior was surprisingly warm and inviting. Rich red carpets stretched along the stone floors, while broad cedar staircases and polished wooden wall panels softened the otherwise imposing grey stone. Glowing crystal sconces and elegant chandeliers illuminated the halls with a gentle golden light, bright enough to see comfortably without feeling harsh on the eyes. The whole place smelled faintly of cedarwood and a crackling fireplace. Inside, we were greeted by 2 neat lines of servants, all bowing respectfully as we passed. Eventually, we arrived at the great hall. At the far end, seated in a magnificent high-backed chair carved from the massive root of an ancient redwood, sat Marquis Romero Balatoa. Beside him was his wife, Eleanor, while standing upon the broad staircase behind them were Robert's 5 siblings, 3 brothers, and 2 sisters, all watching us with varying degrees of curiosity. "Considering the Marquis doesn't look older than 50, I remarked through our soul bond, "the Lord and Lady certainly didn't spend their younger years lazing around." Ventis's cheeks immediately turned a faint shade of pink. "You can be so crude sometimes," she muttered, trying not to smile. I simply shrugged and followed everyone into the hall. The welcoming dinner was incredible. Living in such a cold region clearly influenced the local cuisine. Nearly every dish was served piping hot, from thick stews and roasted meats to freshly baked bread that still steamed after being sliced. My absolute favorite, however, was an incredibly spicy soup filled with chunks of cherry berry. The berries gave it a fiery kick that almost made me tear up. Naturally, I couldn't resist. While nobody was looking, I casually dropped half a sliced cherry berry into Joltion's bowl. He took one confident bite, then his eyes widened. "Hot! Hot! Hot!" He bolted from the dining hall so quickly that several servants nearly dropped their trays. A moment later, we spotted him outside, frantically burying his face in the snow. By the time he came back, his whiskers were dripping with melted snow, and he was giving me the grumpiest stare imaginable. I lasted all of 3 seconds before bursting into laughter. To my surprise, Joltion started laughing too. Noctowl merely sighed and shook his head as though he'd expected nothing less. Primarina, meanwhile, quietly slid one elegant arm over her own bowl. Just to be safe, I was the only one among us who genuinely enjoyed spicy food. Joltion and Primarina both had an undeniable sweet tooth, while Noctowl preferred dry, sour foods for reasons I still couldn't understand. With our bellies full and our luggage delivered to our rooms, everyone finally settled in for the evening. Everyone, except Ventis. She accepted Robert's offered arm and headed out for a quiet walk through the castle grounds, leaving the rest of us to enjoy a well-earned night of rest. Primarina gracefully slipped into the room temperature pool prepared for the Pokémon, letting out a content sigh as the water embraced her. Joltion immediately claimed the softest cushion in the room, kneading it twice before flopping onto it with a satisfied grin. I, meanwhile, settled down beside the crackling fireplace, Noctowl simply flew onto the writing desk and perched there, exactly as he had done back when he was still a little hoot-hoot. I considered pointing out that he was no longer tiny and might eventually collapse the poor desk, but he was the oldest among us. He had earned the right to ignore furniture weight limits. During our journey through the pine forests, I had collected no small number of fallen branches. Now I spread the dry sticks out in front of me, licking my lips in anticipation. "You literally just ate." Primarina shook her head with an amused smile. "These are just snacks," I pouted. She simply stared at me. "What?" With all the dignity I could muster, I picked up the smallest twig and popped it into my mouth, casually nibbling away at it. The dry wood gave off a pleasant resinous flavor, followed by a faint sweetness that reminded me of roasted nuts. It crunched nicely too. I was still a little weirded out by my new tastes. Eating literal wood, snacking on sulfur, treating them as though they were the finest delicacies imaginable. Yet, I couldn't honestly complain. They tasted amazing. I had already curled up into a little ball beside the fireplace when Ventis returned to our room. She looked over at me, and I answered with nothing more than a twitch of one ear. A small smirk appeared on her face. Without another word, she changed into her nightclothes and practically fell onto her bed. She was happy. It was obvious. I couldn't really blame her. Robert was a bit of a nerd. Over the evening, Ventis had told me more about him than I had learned over the past half year. He had been born into a knightly family where aura knights were common. All 5 of his siblings, even his sisters, had been trained as warriors from childhood because they all possessed the talent to wield aura. Robert had inherited none of it, nor did he possess any magical talent. So, instead, he buried himself in books and trained with the sword, believing that the son of a knightly house should at least become a proper swordsman. He wasn't antisocial, merely a little awkward in large gatherings, preferring quieter company whenever he had the choice. Ventis had clearly changed something in him. The boy, or rather, the young man, was doing everything he could to protect her. The feelings flowing through our soul bond told me all I needed to know. This love was genuine. From both of them, I simply smiled to myself and drifted off to sleep beside the warm fireplace. The following morning, Terence asked the Marquis, through Ventis, for permission to head into the mountains and continue doing what he loved most. The moment he received the green light, he, Magmar, and Geodude disappeared through the castle gates. I was honestly just glad Magmar was accompanying him. Being a fire type, he could keep the boy from freezing while they searched the mountains. I liked Terence, but his fascination with rocks bordered on obsession. As for me, I unpacked my training weights, headed down to the Pokémon training grounds, and immediately got to work. This time I focused on jumping, dashing, and dodging imaginary attacks while carrying the immense extra weight. If I wanted to master extreme speed without first accelerating with flame charge, my legs would have to become absurdly powerful. There were no shortcuts, just sweat. And a whole lot of suffering. It had been quite some time since we started training with weights. Jolteon loved it. Primarina despised every second of it. Noctowl, well, he quietly suffered through it. As a flying type, the extra weight was especially brutal on his wings, but the progress was undeniable. Nearly half a year of constant strain and muscle development had turned us into proper gym bros. Thankfully, Pokémon didn't bulk up like humans. Instead, our bodies became leaner and more streamlined. Not an ounce of unnecessary fat remained, only muscles hardened through relentless training. Umbreon had taught us skills. I taught us discipline. Every day was spent building explosive speed, faster reactions, and greater strength. The sleepy town of Blackhall spread around the castle like a belt wrapped around the mountainside. Because of the terrain, the main road was relatively short, while dozens of long side streets followed the contours of the slopes. Life here moved at a calm, steady pace. The people were hard-working but unhurried, and Pokémon were everywhere. Snorunt helped shovel snow from rooftops. A pair of beartick hauled enormous pine logs as though they weighed nothing, and several machoke marched toward the mines alongside groups of miners. That was when I stopped walking, as a grin slowly spread across my muzzle. A memory surfaced. The very first day after arriving in this world, a whole herd of Donphan living near Hagsrot Castle. My thoughts immediately raced ahead. Terrence, the biggest rock nut I'd ever met. Donphan, a Pokémon famous for sniffing out valuable minerals. My eyes slowly turned into little gold coins. Why? I slapped my forehead. Didn't I think of this sooner? Without another word, I spun around and sprinted back toward the castle. I almost crashed headfirst into Feraligatr. Sorry, mate, I shouted, while barely slowing down. I need to speak with Ventis. This is important. Feraligatr blinked as I rushed past. He had absolutely no idea what revelation had just struck me, but judging by the manic grin plastered across my face, he couldn't help chuckling. Being my assigned guardian, he sighed and immediately broke into a run after me. Ventis, I'm coming. Massive idea. I called through our soul bond as I slid to a stop in the corridor before entering the library. Ventis and Robert were both leaning over a stack of books. Of course, I could have simply explained everything through our minds, but I always preferred speaking face-to-face whenever possible. Soul bond or not, it just felt more natural. What is it, Fenn? Ventis asked, immediately noticing the grin plastered across my face. So? I sat down and nodded politely toward Robert. You know how Terrence is. Tell me, how much do you know about Donphan? Ventis frowned thoughtfully. Well, they're rather dangerous Pokémon that live in herds and fiercely protect one another. Their meat is quite tough, and their hide is thick enough that it can only really be worked into armor. She tilted her head. Why? I rubbed the back of my neck. Of course. She only knew what scholars of this era had managed to discover. I know this will come as a bit of a shock, I began, trying to sound like the wise professor I definitely wasn't. But Donphan can actually smell different kinds of rocks and minerals. She blinked. So? I continued, casually waving my wand like a lecturer. If Terrence had one helping him, he'd become at least 10 times more efficient. Donphan are also incredible at smashing through rock faces to reach the specific minerals they're after. Is that really true? Ventis practically shot to her feet. What is? Robert asked. Looking between us, Ventis glanced at me, silently asking whether this was another one of our closely guarded secrets. I simply nodded. It seems Donphan can locate specific rocks and mineral deposits by scent, she explained. Robert stared at me. Then, without saying a single word, he bolted. Not a polite jog. Not even a run. The man took off as though the castle had caught fire. Robert? Ventis called after him. No time, he shouted over his shoulder. Come! Ventis hurried after him, while I had no trouble keeping pace. We raced through the corridors, down a broad staircase, across the inner courtyard, and finally reached a covered area behind the kitchens. Stop! Robert's voice echoed through the yard. A butcher froze mid-swing. His heavy cleaver hung motionless above an unconscious Donphan, suspended by thick ropes over a large wooden basin. Young lord, the butcher slowly lowered his blade. Why did you stop me? Do? Not? Robert bent over, catching his breath. Do? Kill? That? Pokémon? The poor man immediately paled. He even took 2 cautious steps backward away from the Donphan. Robert hurried over, pressed 2 fingers against the Pokémon's neck, and let out a long sigh of relief after finding a pulse. He motioned toward the ropes. Help me lower it. The Donphan wasn't particularly large for its species, but it still weighed around 200 kilograms. Between the two of them, they carefully lowered it onto a thick pile of straw. If I may ask, the butcher ventured carefully, why do you want this Donphan? I was ordered to skin it for leather armor, and the meat was to be turned into Pokémon feed. Robert let out a thoughtful breath before looking back at the unconscious ground type. Because, he answered with a small smile, I believe we've just found a much better use for it. He turned back toward the butcher. And if the hunters head out again, tell them not to kill any more Donphan. Capture them alive if possible. The butcher blinked. Sir? Consider it an order from my father. If there are any questions, I'll personally answer for them." His tone had completely changed. Gone was the shy, awkward young man. For just a moment, he sounded every bit the son of a marquis. I simply stood behind him with a smug grin. When Ventis finally caught up and saw the unconscious Donphan lying safely on the straw, she immediately understood why Robert had run. Sure, Pokémon were just as much food as they were slaves. Only a very select few humans thought of Pokémon as partners. Most, as I had sadly learned, thought of Pokémon as extremely dangerous animals. Many that could pull carriages, like Rapidash, Mudsdale, and even Zebstrika in some cases, were used exactly for that purpose. Dog-like Pokémon served as guards or herders. Bird Pokémon carried messages between towns and castles, and so on. Swinub? Fattened up for meat, just like Tauros and many others. Mareep were prized for their wool, but eventually they too ended up beneath a butcher's knife. It felt wrong to me. Someone who knew Pokémon were thinking beings, far more aware than the cows back in my old world. I shook my head to chase away the grim thoughts and helped Robert with the Donphan. After giving it a collar specifically made by Ventis, we treated its injuries and simply waited. "So this collar?" Robert started, examining it closely. "It does look different." "Oh yeah, it does not dull the mind. It only stops the Pokémon from attacking us or running off," Ventis explained. "I am starting to hate collars. None of my Pokémon wear restrictive ones anymore. Primarina is the only one who had to wear one for a long time, but now the collars you see on them are mainly fashion, and so others don't ask uncomfortable questions." "You do know that this goes against the rules of Pokémon ownership," Robert said with a serious look. "I know," Ventis nodded. "But I don't care. They are my friends, and I don't want to enslave them." I immediately gave her an enthusiastic thumbs up. Robert sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Please don't tell that to just everyone." The young Donphan woke late into the night, when both Ventis and Robert were already too tired to keep waiting. I stayed in the garden, where it was pleasantly warm, resting my back against one of those heat-emitting stones. Of course, when Donphan woke up, he panicked and made enough noise to wake me as well. I lit a small ball of fire atop my wand and walked over to him. "Stay back!" he yelled, his voice far younger than I expected. "Huh? Did you just evolve recently?" I asked. Donphan stopped struggling against the sturdy leash and actually looked at me. Like, really looked. You're not a human. You're a Pokémon," he said, the fear still obvious in his voice. "Ding ding, you're right and earned yourself a cookie," I joked. "A what?" he asked carefully. "Never mind." I shook my head. "So, here's the thing. You were captured and brought to this castle. I'm afraid I can't change that, but there is good news. Your new master is a nice person who'll take care of you, feed you, and make sure you aren't hurt. I want to go back to my herd," Donphan whimpered. I bit my lip. He sounded completely heartbroken. Still, I had essentially saved his life. This was a far better fate than what had been waiting for him. "I know." I slowly reached out, but he instinctively pulled away from my paw. "Look, I'm not going to hurt you, okay? Promise?" he asked quietly. "I promise to Arceus that I won't hurt you unless we both agree to a fight." I placed a paw over my chest before gently patting his head. "See? It's not so bad." I rubbed the underside of one of his hard ears, and his tense posture slowly began to relax. "So, what will happen to me?" he asked. "Well," I playfully poked his long trunk, "you can smell ores and minerals with that amazing nose of yours. You'll probably be asked to sniff out specific rocks, and then lead people to them." "That's it?" he blinked. Believe it or not, that ability to sniff out rocks is exactly what saved your life. I shrugged, continuing to pet him. "By the way, how did you evolve? You sound way too young." A goofy grin spread across his face. "I accidentally knocked out a strong Pokémon that was fighting our herd leader. I couldn't help smirking." "Good one, kid. Stole the last hit, huh? Such a gamer move." "What's a gamer?" he asked. "A super talented and extraordinarily smart Pokémon." I proudly puffed out my chest fluff. Donphan tilted his head so far he somehow became even more adorable. "Are you a gamer?" "Indeed." I spun my wand, the small flame making our shadows dance across the garden walls. "I am one such Pokémon." "Wow," he beamed. "That sounds so cool. Can I become a gamer too?" He leaned a little closer. "Well," I chuckled and gave him another pat on the head. "You've got the basics for it. Let's worry about that tomorrow, though. I'm absolutely exhausted." Curled up beside the warm stone, with Donphan finally calmed down, I slept surprisingly well. By morning I stretched lazily, only to scare a small Pidgey that had been warming itself beside the enchanted rocks. It took off in a panic before I could even apologize for startling it. "Morning, Ventis." I spoke through our bond as I felt her mind slowly waking. "Donphan is okay." I calmed him down during the night, but still tried to approach him slowly. "Nice work, Fenn." She sent me a warm, happy emotion. "I'm going to call Robert. One thing first, ask him if you can have this Donphan. In return, I'll train the next one they capture." "What?" Ventis replied. "I'm already starting to have too many Pokémon as it is." "Well, he'll be with Terrence most of the time anyway." I shrugged, even though she couldn't see it. "Besides, I really like this kid." "Kid?" she asked. "Yeah, he's actually really young. He sounds comparable to a 10-year-old human child." I smiled. "We Pokémon can tell these things." "Well, I'll ask." Ventis sounded hesitant, but not opposed to the idea. 10 minutes later, both of them walked down the broad stone stairs leading into the garden. Donphan, of course, immediately hid behind me, which would have worked a lot better if he hadn't been twice as wide as me. It reminded me of one of those old cartoons where an elephant tries to hide behind a tiny tree. I had to bite my lip to stop myself from laughing. Ventis slowed down, knelt in the grass, and pulled out a few cookies meant for ground-type Pokémon. To me, they smelled faintly of freshly dug-up soil. Donphan, on the other hand, slowly emerged from behind me, sniffing the air with growing curiosity. "Go on, she's nice." I gently nudged his side. Donphan nodded and carefully reached out with his trunk to take one of the cookies. The moment he tasted it, his eyes lit up. He quickly scooped up the rest and happily munched away, not even noticing that Ventis was gently petting his head. "Such a good Donphan," she said in the soothing voice one would use with a child. "Don?" He looked up and finally noticed the purple-haired girl smiling warmly at him. "She is really nice." Donphan looked back at me. "See? I told you." I nodded smugly. "So, you want to have this Donphan?" Robert asked casually. "Well, he'll mostly travel with Terrence as my gatherer of rare minerals." "That seems reasonable," Robert nodded. "Could we test this ability you spoke of?" I simply looked at Ventis. "Sure," she answered. Robert signaled to a servant waiting nearby. The man stepped forward, carrying a piece of very dark, almost pitch-black ore. "This is the last meteoric ore we found, young master." He respectfully handed the rock over. Robert knelt and placed it before Donphan. "Is he asking me to sniff it?" Donphan asked. "Yep, and if you find more of it, I bet you'll get a whole bunch of those nice cookies you just had." "Yay!" He bounced excitedly in place before lowering his trunk to the ore. For nearly a minute he carefully sniffed every side of it. Ventis unclipped the leash, leaving only the collar around his neck. "All right, kiddo, show us what you can do." Donphan's eyes gleamed with excitement. Without another moment's hesitation, he bolted through the castle gates. I sprinted after him while Ventis and Robert did their best to keep up. Soon we reached the entrance to one of the mines, where several workers hurriedly jumped aside to avoid the battering ram of a Pokémon charging through the tunnel. "I can smell it. I can." Donphan beamed at me, hopping excitedly before racing deeper into the mine. 2 minutes later, he came to an abrupt stop at what appeared to be nothing more than a dead end. Sniff! Sniff! He slowly moved his trunk across the rock face before taking several steps backward. Then he tucked in his legs using rollout. Thoom! The wall shook. By the second impact, Ventis and Robert had finally caught up. One nearby miner had already begun nervously chewing on his fingernails while repeatedly glancing at the wooden support beams overhead, clearly praying the tunnel wouldn't collapse on top of us. 6 crushing rollouts later, the wall finally gave way. A massive hole opened before us. I lifted my wand and conjured a ball of fire to illuminate the darkness beyond. The chamber was enormous, at least 20 meters wide and just as tall. Right in its center rested a meteorite nearly 5 meters across. The entire cavern looked as though it had once been filled with molten rock. Its walls were unnaturally smooth, shimmering in the firelight as countless gemstones sparkled from within the polished stone. "By Arceus," the miner whispered. His pickaxe slipped from his hands as he fell to his knees. I simply let out an appreciative whistle. "A meteorite geode," I murmured with a grin. "Huh, neat." "Crystalline structures created due to high heat and pressure," Ventis spoke in my mind. "Just as you told me." "See? I know my stuff." I grinned back through our bond. "Well, if nobody minds, this girl is going on a shopping trip." Before anyone could stop me, I jumped into the cavern and started searching for the cleanest, prettiest gemstones I could find. After stuffing my tail fluff to the brim, I happily trotted back out. No one even tried to stop me, which somehow made it even funnier. Most of them were still standing there in complete awe at the sheer size of the geode. At one point, I even pried a particularly gnarly-looking red gemstone from the wall. It looked like the wet dream of a modern miner. Well, have fun. I waved my wand before running all the way back to my room to admire my loot in proper daylight. Spreading everything across my bed, I examined my findings one by one and had to swallow hard. Every single stone appeared to be valuable. Rubies, sapphires, emeralds, even a few diamonds. The strange red chunk I'd pulled from the wall turned out to be a fist-sized cluster of rubies. It wasn't nearly as transparent as the cut gemstones, but I immediately decided what it would become: the headpiece of a wizard's staff. There was absolutely no way I was missing out on looking like a proper archmage one day. Barely an hour later, the entire castle was buzzing with excitement. What Donphan had found turned out to be worth even more than I had expected. After several experts examined the meteorite and the gemstones surrounding it, they estimated its value at nearly 5,000 gold royals, the large gold coins. Since Ventis had been responsible for discovering the deposit, the Marquis ruled that she would receive 20% of everything earned from its sale. The poor girl fainted on the spot. Donphan, meanwhile, received the treatment of a true hero, a mountain of premium cookies, a relaxing massage from one of the resident machoke, and an absurdly soft pillow waiting for him in our room. The young Pokémon happily rolled back and forth on it, stuffing cookies into his mouth between giggles. He was absolutely loving all the attention. A week later, and after about 6 more Donphan had been captured and collared, the Marquis formed a brand new mining squad. It took me a day or two to calm the Pokémon down and explain that they were about to become the most beloved beings around here before they truly accepted their new lives and roles. Little Don, the nickname Ventis had given our newest member, even helped me. He knew some of the other Donphan from the herd and happily told them about all the good things he had been getting for what he considered barely any work at all. Cookies, warm bedding, plenty of food, and scratches behind the ears apparently made for a very convincing argument. When Terence finally returned from his expedition carrying an overstuffed backpack and a light cold, he couldn't stop smiling between sneezes. He had gathered another batch of moonstones, 5 of them this time, along with 2 firestones and a handful of neat-looking but otherwise useless rocks that he insisted were interesting. The moment he learned what Donphan could do, the boy practically started vibrating like Jolteon after eating too many sweets. It took Ventis nearly 10 whole minutes to stop Terence from sprinting right back into the mountains with his brand new partner. Of course, that was impossible anyway, as we were about to leave for the south and return to Evelna, this time with Robert coming along as well. While I liked the uniqueness of the northern mountain range and the calmness of the people living there, I was genuinely happy to be traveling south again. We had even gained an extra partner out of the whole trip, who was currently resting comfortably inside a crystal Pokeball just like Feraligatr. Arceus bless convenient transportation. Don hadn't worried for even a second when he was told he'd be released again once we reached Evelna. Apparently, after hearing all my stories, he was almost looking forward to meeting everyone there. Terence was a little gloomy about leaving so soon, but he quickly cheered himself up by making plans for future expeditions with Don. Every few hours, he would pull out a notebook and scribble down another mountain or valley he wanted to explore. Ventis and Robert happily chatted together throughout most of the journey, so I eventually tuned them out and simply watched the forests, rivers, and rolling hills slowly drift past the carriage window. After 2 long weeks of travel, we finally arrived. I let out a content sigh the moment I stepped onto the ground. This was proper winter, cold enough to enjoy the season, but not so freezing that my nose felt ready to fall off. Living high in the mountains near Blackhall had been a little too much for my liking. I was a fire type, not an ice type. I wasn't even surprised to see Esther waiting beside her father. She wore a brand new outfit styled after Sylvian, complete with soft ribbons woven into the design, while the very same Pokémon sat proudly at her side. The pair almost looked coordinated. Pelliene, of course, arrived just in time as well, smiling as though the sun itself had finally returned after a long winter's darkness. The moment the carriage rolled to a stop, Esther was already hurrying toward us. "Fenn!" Before I could even react, the girl wrapped both arms around me and pulled me into a hug. Oof! My paws instinctively stuck out to the sides as my brain tried to process what was happening. "I missed you so much." Esther beamed, squeezing me tightly. "Help!" Nobody did. Count Alderic merely smiled into his beard while Pelliene outright laughed. "Oh, don't be so stiff, Fenn. I am currently being hugged against my will. I spoke in Pokémon Tunge, but not one of my team helped. The traitors." Esther giggled and, somehow, hugged even tighter. "You're fluffy." "I know I'm fluffy. That does not make me public property." She finally loosened her grip enough for me to breathe again before looking at me with slightly guilty eyes. "I wanted to apologize again." I looked at her for a long moment. The spoiled noble brat I had first met was simply gone. In her place stood a somewhat awkward young lady who genuinely wanted to make things right. Breaks. Very awkwardly, I patted her shoulder. After everything settled down and our team finally returned to Ventis's room, I immediately noticed a pleasant change. The corner where the old bronze bathtub had once stood now housed a small indoor pool made specifically for Pokémon. Primarina spotted it first. She practically dove into the water, letting out a blissful sigh as she floated on the surface. "Ah, water. I missed you so much." She completely relaxed, looking as though she might melt into the pool itself. "So this is your place?" Feraligatr looked around the room before scratching his chin. "Seems way too small." "It's called cozy." Noctowl rolled his eyes as he landed on the writing desk, making the old piece of furniture creak under his weight. "My snuggle pillow." Jolteon immediately tackled his old cushion and rolled across it with pure happiness. I simply walked over to my own bed, one that had been custom-made for my size. The moment I sat down, I slowly sank into the mattress. After letting out a long sigh, I leaned back with a smile. Ah, so much softer than that stiff bed in the capital. I stretched my paws above my head. There really is no place like home, and I meant it. Yvelna had become home to me. The grumpy Umbreon, the proud Stantler, and even the few Spearow I'd somehow befriended by feeding them the leftover crumbs from the castle kitchen. They were all part of it now. With Terence having run off to Arceus New Ware, and Ventis essentially enjoying both her honeymoon and a well-earned holiday, I suddenly realized I wanted to do something other than train. Maybe? A hobby? But what? It wasn't as though Pokémon in this world really had hobbies. As I sat there pondering all the possibilities, I suddenly felt a gentle tug. It wasn't my soul bond with Ventis. It was something else. A strange sensation, almost like an invisible hand quietly encouraging me to take a walk. Since I was already restless after spending weeks inside a carriage, I decided not to question it and headed outside. Naturally, my assigned guardian, the big blue alligator known as Feraligatr, fell into step behind me without saying a word. Outside the castle walls, a flash of light suddenly appeared. A Kadabra teleported into existence, making both me and my guard jump into fighting stances. "Peace," Kadabra immediately held up both hands. Remember me? You freed me. Wait. I placed a paw on Feraligator's arm before he could charge. I know this one. I looked the psychic type up and down. He looked awful. Several cuts covered his body. His ribs were clearly visible beneath his skin, and he swayed slightly where he stood. What happened to you? I asked. Turns out. He slumped onto the ground with a tired sigh. I'm terrible at surviving in the wild. I really don't want another master. His voice cracked. But I don't want to starve either. The poor guy looked ready to cry. A fully grown, adult Pokémon. Hey, hey! I hurried over and helped him back onto his feet. Come on, dude! I motioned for Feraligator to help, and together we supported the nearly unconscious Kadabra as we brought him inside the castle grounds. Damn Fenn. Umbreon chuckled as we walked past him. You should have gone easy on the poor Kadabra. It wasn't me, all right? I rolled my eyes. Rather, get him something to eat. What am I? A servant? Umbreon asked, sounding mildly offended. One glare from me was enough. Fine, whatever. He turned around with a dramatic sigh. Wins against me once and suddenly thinks she can boss me around, he muttered as he disappeared toward the kitchens. We stopped beside a fountain where I splashed a little water onto Kadabra's face before helping him drink. Thank you, he whispered, sounding genuinely grateful. So, how exactly did you mess up living in the wild? I didn't have much trouble. I paused. Well, little trouble. When I was still a Fennekin, Kadabra gave a bitter smile. I grew up beside humans. I had no idea what was edible and what wasn't. It took me ages just to find enough food, and every time I did, other Pokémon tried to chase me away. He sighed. I'm used to fighting one opponent at a time, not an entire group. Yeah, I nodded knowingly. I learned that lesson the hard way on my second day. Umbreon returned a minute later with a plate balanced in his mouth. A small stack of Poké cookies rested on top. Kadabra didn't even bother being polite. He devoured them, as though his life depended on it. Well, I leaned against the fountain with a grin. Even if you don't want an owner, you can still work for your food. Kadabra looked up between mouthfuls. How about becoming my training partner? You want us to fight? Sometimes, I shrugged. And every now and then you could use teleport as a fast travel service. Grade A premium taxi. Kadabra blinked. I have no idea what she just meant. He looked at Umbreon. Umbreon snorted. Trust me, neither do I. I just got used to her saying gibberish every now and then. The old dark type chuckled. Since there was no way we could squeeze yet another Pokémon into our room, and the manor had dozens of empty guest rooms, I decided to show Kadabra to one of them. Rest here. I'll handle things with Count Alderic. I led him to a neatly made bed after Primarina had helped clean him up. The water type had used a very gentle water gun while I dried his fur with towels and a bit of controlled heat. He looked considerably better now, free of briars, dirt, and the grime of months spent wandering. Thank you, again. He smiled weakly. You saved me a second time. I'd like to think I'm collecting good karma. I winked before leaving him to get some well-deserved rest. After grabbing my slate and a fresh piece of chalk, I hurried to Count Alderic. So here's the deal. I freed a Kadabra from my would-be kidnapper half a year ago, and the poor guy wasn't meant for life in the wild. He's here now, weak and malnourished. He doesn't want to belong to anyone, but he's willing to trade his services for food and shelter. I finished writing after several pauses to wipe the slate clean. It took far too long, and I was becoming increasingly frustrated with my inability to speak human. My tongue simply refused to cooperate. I don't really like the idea of a wild Pokémon living in my manor, Alderic sighed. Well, there are plenty of Spearow and Rattata coming and going, I wrote before shrugging. Those are wild too. Let's not compare Vermin to a combat-capable Pokémon. He shook his head. Then how about his teleport ability? What about it? Alderic raised an eyebrow. He could teleport you to places he's already been, including the capital. Imagine being able to travel there and back in the blink of an eye. I tapped the slate with a smug grin. Pokémon can't teleport humans, only themselves. He dismissed the idea with another shake of his head. That statement genuinely stunned me. Did people really not know this? Oh, I was about to shatter this man's worldview. I mean, they can. It just seems nobody has ever tried it. The look on his face. Oh, Arceus above. I wished cameras existed just so I could preserve that expression forever. Prove it! Alderic stood up so abruptly his chair scraped across the floor. Maybe after our guest isn't on the brink of starvation? I tilted my head. Right. He slowly sat back down again. You did write that he nearly died in the wilderness. He rubbed his chin for a moment before looking back at me. As soon as he's healthy enough, I want you to send one of my guards to the capital with a letter and bring back a reply, if this truly works. He paused, his eyes narrowing. It would change transportation across the entire kingdom. I simply saluted, since my chalk had been worn down to little more than a tiny white nub. Ventis was almost impossible to talk to outside of the mornings and evenings, as she spent most of her days with Robert. They wandered through town, read books together, and, stuff. I left the lovebirds alone. Since I was bored out of my mind, I strapped on my training weights, adding another 50 pounds to my original set, and headed for the training grounds. I struck a dramatic pose once I made sure nobody was watching. This is only my second form, Goku. I laughed in the voice I remembered from a certain alien conqueror. What are you doing? The sudden voice made me jump. Unfortunately, with all that extra weight, jumping mostly meant tipping over like a felled tree. Arceus above! I yelped as I crashed onto my side. My heart almost leapt out of my chest. Kadabra looked down at me before helping me back onto my feet, his still weak muscles visibly straining. Don't ever teleport behind me and scare me like that, I huffed, dusting myself off. It was funny though. A second voice came from my other side. Without even thinking, I threw a punch. Sadly, my paw passed straight through the grinning ghost's face as he burst into laughter. Alderic's haunter? You're a rare sight. I groaned as the two idiots successfully teamed up to scare me. I didn't know about him. Kadabra instinctively took a defensive stance behind me. Don't worry, I waved a paw dismissively. Haunter isn't evil, although his sense of humor is questionable. I sighed, remembering the few times we'd met. Haunter floated around me in a slow circle before eyeing the straps around my arms and legs. So, what's all this stuff you're wearing? Weights. I answered with a resigned sigh. I'm doing some serious training. Or rather, I was trying to. Haunter tilted his head. I only saw you strike a pose and talk to yourself like a fool. I slowly lowered my head. Please, just leave me with what little dignity I have left. My ears drooped, and I could feel my face heating up. Both Haunter and Kadabra burst out laughing. After I was finally left to my own devices, I got to work. This time I knew for certain that I would reach my goal of using extreme speed. All I did was practice quick attack under the heavy weights, taking short breaks to drink some water and rest my legs. Even after almost a full year of training, that damned move was still unreachable without using at least one flame charge to boost my speed. Well, not yet. Jolteon joined me about an hour later, while Primarina decided that cheering from the sidelines was a perfectly acceptable form of exercise. Noctowl, meanwhile, chose to sleep. Typical. After a whole week of pushing myself to my absolute limit, I stopped beside the main road and let out a long breath. This is it. I lowered my stance. The next moment, I shot down the straight dirt road at such incredible speed that the wind almost felt like it was biting into my fur. I did it! I shouted from nearly 2 miles away, my voice barely carrying back to Feraligatr. With another burst of extreme speed, I returned in the blink of an eye, a thick cloud of dust racing after me before finally overtaking us. Incredible! Feraligatr slowly nodded. I honestly didn't believe your kind could learn that move. I used it by accident the first time when I was supercharged with electric energy. I dusted myself off. Ever since then, almost 10 months now. It's been my dream to learn it properly. I stretched my neck with a satisfied grin. Even now, I think I'm only barely using it the way it's meant to be. When I returned to the manor, I found Kadabra waiting for me and led him to Count Alderic. One of the household guards had already been selected for the experiment. Alderic wrote a short letter, sealed it with wax, and handed it to the soldier. "I trust you, Kadabra, to bring my man back safely." And with a reply, he gave the psychic type a serious nod. "Kakadabra!" He saluted smartly. In the blink of an eye, both he and the guard vanished. I still can't believe nobody ever thought to try this. Alderic shook his head slowly. Beside him, his advisor silently picked his jaw up off the floor. It didn't take more than 2 hours before the very same soldier returned with Kadabra and a letter in tow. Alderic examined the blue wax seal, nodded in satisfaction, broke it open, and began reading. His Capital Manor's butler had written back a short report on the current situation in the city. It was undeniable proof. "So you're telling me he can teleport anywhere?" Alderic asked. Kadabra leaned toward me and quietly explained that there were certain spots of power, mostly places with many people gathered together, or locations rich in mystical energy. Those acted as anchors for teleport. In practice, it meant every town or city he had visited, along with a handful of unique places scattered across the kingdom. Once that was explained, Alderic made his decision almost immediately. Kadabra was given an official title as the Manor's royal courier and assigned a small carriage with 6 guards as an escort. Their mission was simple: travel to every major town and city throughout the kingdom during the winter and establish teleportation points. I was honestly a little miffed about it. There went my training partner. Still, I had to admit, the Count was thinking several moves ahead. If this worked, his house would possess the fastest communication network in the entire nation. Now that I finally had extreme speed under my belt, I decided it was time to whip my own team back into shape. They'd been taking it easy for the past month, with all the traveling and sightseeing. The only exception was Jolteon, the battle junkie, who had continued training on his own. "All right," I stomped my foot on the ground. "Line up, 1-2, 1-2. Come on, maggots!" The others slowly gathered, each wearing a different expression of impending doom. Noctowl, aerial ace drills, Primarina, land speed training, Jolteon. I looked at him for a second. "Just keep doing whatever insane thing you usually do." "Got it," he grinned. "Hop, hop, hop, everyone to the training field. Move it." With groans and very visible annoyance, aside from the electric maniac, they shuffled after me. Feraligator laughed from the sidelines. That was a seriously convincing drill instructor impression. "You're more than welcome to join." I shot him a grin as I hurried toward the training grounds. And so we ended up occupying nearly every free section of the training yard, working like complete maniacs. Well, most of us did. The winter became training time. I remembered last year, when we were only just starting to form a proper team. Noctowl had still been a hoot-hoot back then, and we hadn't had nobles trying to kidnap or assassinate us. Now I had to think about the Jaushara royal family, spies, and all the other lovely things that came with becoming important. After Terence's accident, and my own kidnapping, I had finally gotten a proper reality check. It was time to hit the accelerator. My next goal was learning Lightning Punch. Thankfully, there was already one Pokémon around who knew the move, Magmar. Luckily, Terence and the others returned only 2 weeks later. Judging by the look on his face and the literal cart being pulled into the manor, I braced myself for another absurd discovery. We already had trouble selling all the evolution stones he'd found. What he unloaded this time, however, made me jump with joy. 2 more high-quality gemstones suitable for carving into Pokeballs, an ice stone, a leaf stone, and an entire pile of revives, several of which looked suspiciously like max revives. The yellowish stones practically radiated life energy. Apparently, Don had found a whole vein of them, and they just kept digging more out. Terence. Ventis blinked. "Where did you get a Mudbray?" She gently petted the little donkey Pokémon, who happily leaned into the scratches. I traded a few gemstones to a merchant for him. Terence shrugged before pulling a carrot from his backpack and feeding the delighted Mudbray. He was actually happy to part with him. He is a cutie too. "All right," I spoke to Ventis through our bond. "I think it's time to turn our stone savings into actual value." "You think it's all right?" she asked. "Oh, absolutely," I nodded. Together, we carried all the stones into Terrence's secure storage room. Inside, we carefully sorted everything onto labeled shelves. 8 firestones, check. 7 moonstones, check. 2 lightning stones, check. 3 leaf stones, check. 3 water stones, check. I continued counting before grinning. 1 dawn stone, 1 dusk stone, 1 sunstone, and 1 ice stone. Checkaroo. Ventis couldn't help rolling her eyes. So, about the plan. She pulled out a somewhat crumpled sheet of paper. We send 2 water stones to King Callister with a note. Add 4 moonstones as well. I continued checking our inventory. We really don't need that many, and the king has very deep pockets. Got it. She quickly scribbled down the change. Then we sell 1 ice stone, 2 leaf stones, and 3 firestones to the count. She scratched her head with the back of her charcoal pencil. Are you sure he'll pay well? Oh, I'm sure, I grinned. Imagine Eevee evolutions coming out of his county like candy. Every noble family would become desperate to get their hands on one. That leaves us with all the rare stones. 1 water stone, 2 moonstones, and 5 firestones. She nodded to herself before looking back at me. Why keep so many? Wouldn't it be better to sell everything? Well, I folded my arms. If you really become an Archmage one day, you might need a few extremely powerful Pokémon. Besides, these stones are only this common because nobody knew they existed. Once word spreads, every miner in the kingdom will start searching for them. I smiled knowingly. No secret stays buried forever. We should keep the rarer stones. Who knows if we'll ever find more when we actually need them? Ventis slowly nodded. Good point. With our decision made, we prepared an elegantly decorated wooden box. Inside, we carefully placed 2 water stones and 4 moonstones. Along with them, I wrote a short note. The water stones could evolve Eevee into Vaporeon for the prince, or perhaps be used on a Staryu to obtain a Starmie for the king if he wished. As for the moonstones, my instructions were wonderfully simple. Have a Nidorino and a Nidorina touch these. With the box magically sealed and entrusted to Peliane's faithful Swellow, we finally headed to Count Alderic. Alderic was in the middle of his usual afternoon tea when we arrived. I couldn't quite tell whether he was happy or frustrated to see us, as his face cycled through several emotions in the span of a few seconds. Still, I let Ventis handle the negotiations while I casually sat down beside Umbreon. Count Alderic. Ventis smiled politely. I am sure Peliane has already informed you about the stones. She did. Alderic nodded with a smile. So, are you finally ready to part with one? He asked, barely hiding the greed in his voice. Well, not exactly. Ventis chuckled, making the Count frown slightly. We would actually like to sell you several. You have more? The Count practically leapt out of his chair. Ventis carefully opened the long wooden box she had been carrying. Nestled inside, 6 beautifully polished stones shimmered in the afternoon light. 1 pale blue, 2 vibrant green, and 3 deep crimson gems. The red ones are firestones for Flareon, the green ones are leaf stones for Leafeon, and the blue one is an ice stone for Glaceon, Ventis explained. Alderic had to grab the armrest of his ornate chair to keep himself from collapsing. So, his voice trembled slightly, you're telling me I could own the 2 rarest Eevee evolutions in the entire kingdom? Indeed. Ventis nodded. Patrick! He suddenly roared. His advisor appeared almost instantly. Bring me 2 fully matured Eevees from the group we plan to sell this winter. Patrick didn't even answer. He simply turned and sprinted. How much? Alderic asked, not taking his eyes off the stones for even a second. After much consideration, Ventis glanced at me before continuing. We're willing to sell the firestones for 200 gold shillings each, while the rarer stones are 500 each. Sold! The Count's answer came so quickly I wasn't even sure he'd finished hearing the sentence. That comes to 2,100 gold shillings. He clapped once. A nearby guard hurried over, received a hastily scribbled note, and immediately ran toward the treasury. A few minutes later, Patrick returned, carrying an Eevee under each arm. Both Pokémon looked mildly offended by the mode of transportation. Old Eric carefully reached into the box and picked up the pale blue stone and one of the green ones before kneeling beside the Eevees. "This will help you evolve," he whispered gently, making sure neither of them became frightened. He slowly touched each Pokémon with its respective stone. Light erupted. A moment later, an elegant Glaceon and a beautiful Leafeon stood where the Eevees had been. Both blinked several times before, excitedly examining their own new bodies. "They're wonderful." Alderic's voice softened into something almost fatherly as he gently stroked each of them. "Oh, aren't you two beautiful?" "Yes, you are. Such gorgeous little ones." The newly evolved Pokémon happily leaned into the affection. "Beside me," Umbreon sighed. "I think we lost him. We definitely lost him." I chuckled into Ventis's mind. "You're starting to get used to owning a lot of money," I spoke to Ventis as we walked back to our room. "I've grown tired of fainting," she answered with an exhausted smile. "Besides, I'm kind of over it. I already sent 50 gold shillings to my parents, so they won't have to worry for years, and I stored the rest in the capital bank. And now we've almost filled up the expanded storage of that weird magical satchel again." I chuckled. "Indeed," she grinned. Back in the room, I immediately bumped into Jolteon, who had somehow managed to fall asleep right beside the door. To avoid stepping on him, I stumbled sideways and slammed into the bookshelf. "Jolteon, could you not sleep beside the door?" I grumbled as I picked up the books that had scattered across the floor and placed them back one by one. The last one made me pause. Archmage Zolnaria's healing booklet. Ventis had completely given up on deciphering it, while I'd nearly driven myself mad trying to understand the old lunatic's ramblings. The man was undoubtedly a genius, but he also wrote in a way that only another genius could ever hope to follow. Since I wasn't planning to train this late in the afternoon anyway, I sighed and decided to give it another chance, or burn it out of spite. The room was pleasantly quiet. I'd made sure our mornings were packed with training, so everyone was tired. Primarina lazily munched on berries beside her pool. Noctowl was already half asleep on his perch, while Jolteon merely grumbled at my earlier shouting and dragged his pillow over to the window before collapsing onto it again. I climbed onto my bed, leaned against the wall, and opened the booklet. I'd already read it once, but maybe I'd overlooked something. When I reached the page filled with what I'd always called Pidgey scratchings, I frowned. It still didn't resemble writing in the slightest. With a sigh, I tossed the booklet onto the bed beside me. Then, I slowly picked it back up. Turning it sideways, I suddenly noticed something I'd somehow missed before. There were 5 horizontal lines, and those strange little blobs. My eyes widened. I'd learned to play the guitar back on Earth. Notes. My mind practically screamed the word. Without thinking, I quietly hummed the melody written across the page. Barely 10 seconds passed before I heard several soft thuds around the room. "Huh?" Looking up, I froze. Primarina was asleep in the pool. Noctowl had fallen right off his perch. Jolteon was snoring into his pillow. Even Feraligatr had slid down the wall beside the door, fast asleep. A slow, downright evil grin spread across my muzzle. "Oh!" I looked back at the innocent-looking booklet. "This is Pokémon Sing." There was, quite obviously, only one reasonable thing left to do. Suppressing my laughter, I grabbed a cold piece of charcoal from the fireplace and quietly walked from Pokémon to Pokémon. Jolteon received an impressive curled moustache. Noctowl got bushy eyebrows worthy of an old wizard. Primarina earned elegant whiskers and beauty marks. Even Feraligatr wasn't spared, ending up with tiny spectacles and a distinguished goatee. Lastly, Ventis, a magnificent curly moustache. Round spectacles, rosy circles on both cheeks. I took a few careful steps back to admire my work before biting my lip to keep from bursting out laughing. "Oh, this little booklet," I snickered quietly, "is an absolute gem." Now I understood that I needed to look at all those weird scratches as something other than writing. The next page wasn't a song, but as I focused on it, I felt normal-type energy gathering inside me. A pleasant warmth spread through my body, and a moment later I instinctively knew a new move. Wish, a healing ability. The page after that carried water-type energy, which immediately clashed with my own. My eyes simply glazed over as I stared at the scribbles, unable to make sense of them. I shook my head and turned the page. Grass-type energy. Again, nothing. I simply didn't have that element inside me. The following page, however, reacted differently. Since Ventis always kept flowers in our room, I suddenly felt fairy-type energy flowing from the nearby blossoms. It gathered around me, trying to settle inside my body. I knew I wasn't a fairy type, yet somehow the magically written notes forced the knowledge into my mind. Floral healing. I blinked in surprise. I can only use this near flowers, I murmured, instinctively understanding the move's limitation. And even then, barely. I carefully turned another page. Another, and another. This booklet, I whispered, my ears slowly rising. Holy Arceus. Every page wasn't a language. It was an imprint. Like an old-school TM disc from the games, except instead of a machine, someone had written the move into existence through magic. The best one came near the end. Heal Pulse. Unlike the game, this version wasn't just a beam of healing energy. I instinctively understood that it could restore not only my own injuries, but also those of nearby allies. It was absurdly efficient. This is broken. I couldn't help but giggle. My first thought wasn't even about using it myself. It was about making everyone else read the booklet. I wonder what Primarina would learn. Noctowl? Jolteon? My grin only widened. With my entire team snoring thanks to Sing, I quietly slipped outside to find the only member still awake. Magmar. Hey, big guy. I tapped his shoulder. He was lying comfortably in the garden with a snack tray balanced on his stomach. Tired? Nope. He lazily tossed another cookie into his mouth. Just enjoying the peace. It's hard to rest when following Terrence around. The kid's like an IPOM on a sugar rush. Yeah. I nodded with a chuckle. That he is. I plopped down beside him and, while he wasn't looking, casually stole one of his cookies. I was wondering, could you teach me Lightning Punch? Magmar raised an eyebrow. I'm not even sure your kind can learn it. Why not Fire Punch? I already have plenty of fire moves. I shrugged while sneaking another cookie. I need some variety. Besides, I flashed him a confident grin. I'm pretty sure I can learn it. He scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, Terrence needs at least a week of rest anyway. He doesn't show it much, but he twisted his ankle pretty badly during the trip. That's both bad and good, I guess. I shrugged, reaching for yet another cookie. Magmar slapped my paw away. Get your own. Sure. I laughed, rubbing my paw dramatically before leaning back to watch the clouds lazily drift across the winter sky. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I was already planning tomorrow's training. Lightning Punch wasn't going to learn itself. The next morning, Primarina was the only one who managed to learn more moves. She picked up both Floral Healing and Aqua Ring. Noctowl learned Pain Split, which I knew could become absolutely broken if used well, while the others couldn't learn anything from the booklet. That didn't stop our regular training. Primarina still needed to become faster on land, so she spent the morning sprinting around the training field instead of lounging in water. Jolteon needed to improve his dodging, so he was sent to the log course where Swinging Trunks tried their best to smack him into next week. Noctowl's strength was already good enough, but against Umbreon he had missed almost every attack during their last spar. His new exercise was simple: launch several rocks into the air and hit every single one before they touched the ground. As for me, I was sitting beside Magmar, focusing on the tiny amount of lightning-type energy that barely existed inside my body. Ready? He asked. As I'll ever be. A gentle lightning punch struck my shoulder. The jolt wasn't meant to hurt. Instead, I focused on drawing that electrical energy into myself, trying to understand it and make it my own. Again, and again, and again. Even though Magmar held back immensely, the repeated shocks slowly wore me down. My muscles twitched involuntarily, and by midday my fur looked like I'd stuck my tail into a thundercloud. All right, I huffed, stuffing an orange berry into my numb mouth. Break? The berry barely dulled the tingling in my cheeks. This is some seriously messed up training. My father taught me this way, Magmar answered between breaths. I slowly looked him up and down. Now I understand why you turned out like this. I chuckled. Thump. His fist met my back, not charged with electricity this time. Ow! I was being nice. I lied, though he did not buy it. What truly made me grin was Ventis. After watching me decipher the healing booklet, she decided to read through it herself. Much to everyone's shock, she somehow managed to convert 2 of the Pokémon moves into actual human magic. Most of the attempts failed spectacularly, producing nothing more than sparks or collapsing spell circles. Healing Pulse and Wish. Healing Pulse became an area spell centered around herself. Anyone close enough could slowly recover from wounds, as long as she maintained the magic. Wish, on the other hand, worked at a distance. It took several seconds before the healing arrived, making it less useful in the middle of a frantic battle, but perfect for supporting someone who'd been forced away from her. No matter. We finally had proper healing magic that could keep us fighting, instead of praying we wouldn't get hurt. Ventis didn't stop there. She began branching into utility spells as well. Levitation allowed her to lift objects without touching them. Another spell magically locked doors, chests, or practically anything with a lid, reinforcing them to the point where brute force barely worked anymore. That one made Robert very interested. Personally, I preferred the cleaning spell. Instead of dragging me into another bath, Ventis could simply cast it, and every bit of dust, soot, mud, and grime vanished from my coat. It even fluffed my tail back up afterward. I became an immediate fan. She also mastered a repair spell. It wasn't some ridiculous miracle that could restore shattered objects, but torn clothes, cracked leather, snapped straps, and minor damage could all be mended surprisingly well. By the time winter settled in properly, every single one of us had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings began with training. Afternoons were spent studying, experimenting, or helping around the manor. Evenings usually ended with someone collapsed from exhaustion. Eventually, even Terrence and his Pokémon started joining us regularly. Gathering minerals was one thing, but after everything that had happened, the boy wanted to become stronger himself. Magmar pushed his flames higher. Little Don repeatedly charged stone walls until they cracked, while Geodude stubbornly refused to lose against gravity every time I made him climb cliffs with extra weights tied to him. 2 full months of relentless training, and more than a few real battles against wild Pokémon finally paid off. One afternoon, Geodude suddenly began to glow. The familiar light of evolution surrounded him, his body growing larger and heavier before finally revealing a proud Graveler. Terrence actually cried. Little Don rolled around in circles, cheering loud enough that half the nearby Spearow flock took off in fright. The celebration lasted the entire evening. Before long, winter slowly began giving way to spring. Snow melted from the hillsides, birds returned to the forests, and everyone knew what that meant. Our second year at the academy was drawing closer. That final week before departure became our hardest yet. Primarina no longer feared training. In fact, she enjoyed it. The former diva now arrived at the training field before I did on some mornings, already stretching and demanding another race across the grounds. Jolteon had become an absolute menace. He was so fast and agile that even Umbreon struggled to land a clean hit on him. Noctowl's accuracy had reached an absurd level. He could launch 17 stones into the air and strike every single one before the first touched the ground. As for me, I stood before a battered training dummy, my fist crackling with yellow lightning. Lightning punch. Crack! The blow exploded through the dummy, sending straw flying across half the training yard. I couldn't help smiling. During the winter, we received letters from both the king and the second prince. They were delighted with the gifts and promised us something nice in return once we arrived back in the capital. Since we had already packed everything and were ready to leave, we decided to keep the remaining evolution stones hidden here. Ventis sealed them with several layers of magic before we buried them beneath a massive old oak, marking the place only in our memories. Terrence decided to remain at Evelna with his Pokémon. There were still plenty of unexplored hills around the county, and the chance of being ambushed by some unseen noble's agent was much lower than near the capital. Honestly, I agreed with the decision. He now had a Graveler, Magmar, Donphan, and even a cart pulled by a cute little mudbray. The donkey Pokémon had quickly grown attached to the rest of the team and happily trotted after them wherever they went. For a peasant-born servant, Terence now travelled with as many Pokémon as some nobles owned personally. Of course, legally they were all still registered under Ventis's name. Not that any of us really cared. Ventis also technically owned 6 Mudsdales now. 2 remained here with the old carriage, while the 4 I liked pulled our newer, far more luxurious one. I was in the middle of checking our luggage when something made my fur stand on end. It wasn't a sound, nor a smell. Just a feeling, like a terrible omen pressing against my instincts. Without thinking, I slipped off the roof of the carriage and landed silently on the gravel path. My eyes swept across the manor grounds. Nothing. The garden was peaceful. Servants carried crates and luggage as they chatted amongst themselves. Pidgeys chirped somewhere in the trees, while other small Pokémon busied themselves around the flower beds. Our own team was saying their goodbyes before the long journey northwest. Everything looked normal. I closed my eyes and focused my senses as far as they would reach. Nothing. After nearly a full minute, I slowly let out the breath I'd been holding. I was sure I felt something. I muttered to myself. Through our bond, I reached out to Ventis. "Don't be alarmed, but keep your wand in your hand once we leave. I might just be jumpy, but something felt off." "I will." She gave me a subtle nod before speaking through our link again. "Warn the others in Pokémon tongue." I quietly passed the warning to the rest of our team. Jolteon's ears perked up immediately. Primarina stopped chatting. Noctowl silently scanned the tree line. Even Feraligatr's usually relaxed posture stiffened ever so slightly. One by one, we climbed into the carriage. As it rolled away from the manor gates, I couldn't shake the feeling crawling at the back of my mind. I just hoped that my instincts were playing tricks on me. Carnelio crouched behind one of the manor's tall stone chimneys, his illusion magic bending the light around him until his silhouette all but vanished. Even the falling snow seemed to slip past without disturbing the spell. Resting against his belt was a crystal Pokéball. Inside waited Kabutops, the perfect weapon against a Bryxon. How the clan elder had managed to combine forbidden magic with ancient fossils and restore an extinct Pokémon was beyond Carnelio's understanding. He had stopped asking questions years ago. His job wasn't to understand, it was to kill. The Haxon ducal family had issued a simple contract. Ventis Balatoa, her Bryxon. Neither was to arrive to the capital alive. Carnelio remained perfectly still, barely allowing himself to breathe as he watched the courtyard below. Servants loaded luggage onto the carriage while Pokémon wandered between them. Knights chatted with stable hands. It looked like any other peaceful departure. Then his target moved. The Bryxon casually tightened a loose rope on top of the carriage. A heartbeat later, her ears snapped upright. She froze. Every muscle in her body tensed. Slowly, far too slowly for comfort. She turned her head. Not toward the gate, not toward the servants, toward him. Carnelio's pulse slammed against his ribs. No, she can't. The Bryxon leapt from the carriage roof, landing silently before scanning the entire garden. Her sharp blue eyes swept across rooftops, windows, walls, and paused. For one dreadful second, Carnelio became convinced they were staring directly at him. A cold bead of sweat rolled down his neck. Impossible! His illusion concealed not only his body but even the faint traces of mana around him. He had hidden from archmages before. There was no reason a Brajan should notice him. Unless he forced the thought from his mind. Without making a sound, he slowed his breathing and suppressed every trace of hostile intent until his mind became as still as a frozen lake. The Bryxon kept searching. Another second passed. Then another. Finally, she looked away. Carnelio didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply waited. Below, he saw the Bryxon turn towards her trainer. The young noble gave the tiniest nod before subtly resting a hand on her wand. The other Pokémon changed as well. The Jolteon's ears remained rigid. The Noctowl stopped pretending to be relaxed. Even the large Feraligatr shifted his weight ever so slightly, placing himself where he could intercept an attack. They know. Not where, not who, but they knew something was wrong. Carnelio clicked his tongue silently. There would be another chance. There always was. His form dissolved into the chimney's shadow. A whispered spell escaped his lips, and by the time the first carriage rolled through the manor gates, the rooftop was empty. Only the wind remained. This wasn't the first assignment the Haxon family had given his clan against this target. It was the second. The first had been much simpler. Scare them away from the capital. The target had been the servant boy, Terence. Killing the miner was supposed to frighten Ventis into leaving the academy and returning to the countryside. That mission had failed. Not only had the boy survived, but too many innocent people had been caught in the rockslide. The clan had formally apologized to Duke Haxon for the sloppy execution. Strangely enough, the Duke had withdrawn the contract on Terence shortly afterward. No replacement mission followed. Something about waiting. Carnelio never questioned orders. He wasn't stupid, though. Every assassin received enough information to understand the political landscape surrounding a contract. It reduced mistakes. Duke Haxon had long been at odds with County Velna. Then this girl had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Ventis, a former peasant. Within a single year she had attracted the favor of the king himself, earned the attention of the Archmage, and somehow raised Count E. Velna's standing among the nobility. Rumor even suggested the Count might soon be elevated in rank, all because of one young mage. And her extraordinary breakson. Carnelio also knew there were noble houses quietly working against King Callister's rule. The Haxon family stood among them, though proving such a thing was another matter entirely. To those houses, seeing a common-born girl become so closely associated with the second prince and the Archmage must have been unbearable. Carnelio, of course, was merely a tool, and tools weren't supposed to have opinions. Yet, he couldn't help admiring the girl. Much like himself, she had come from nothing. The difference was that she had climbed upward into the light, while he had disappeared into the shadows. Whether she had sought fame or stumbled into it didn't matter. She had changed the kingdom. He tightened his grip on the crystal Pokeball at his belt. It is a shame, he murmured to himself, to snuff out such a bright light. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes. Then, the assassin returned. A job was still a job. The carriage ride was tense. I couldn't feel that strange sensation anymore. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was like having a laser sight aimed at my head. I couldn't see the beam or feel its heat, yet I knew it was there, waiting, watching. Don't worry, Commander Lewis gave us a confident thumbs up. I'm here to protect you. He certainly looked like someone who could arm wrestle an Urzaring before breakfast. Ventis had lent him one of her crystal Pokeballs, for alligator resting inside, ready to be released at a moment's notice. None of us were worried about the academy anymore. By late afternoon, the tension eased slightly. I tried to distract myself by watching spring slowly reclaim the countryside. Early flowers dotted the fields, and fresh green leaves had begun appearing on the trees. That evening we stopped at a roadside tavern. Commander Lewis insisted on taking the first watch himself, standing outside our room with one hand resting on his sword. For alligator waited in the garden directly beneath our window, refusing to sleep. It was the middle of the night when my eyes suddenly flew open. The feeling. It was back. The glass window before me silently dissolved into grey mist. A figure dressed entirely in black slipped through the opening without making a sound. In his hand was a crystal Pokeball already glowing with magic. A flash of light. A Pokémon emerged. Kabutops, my mind screamed. Without hesitation, I flooded our soul bond with raw panic. Ventis woke instantly, just in time. A poisoned dagger stopped less than an inch from her throat as the enchanted ring gifted by Prince Augustine burst into life. A translucent barrier flared around her neck, stopping the blade with a sharp crack. I didn't even have time to breathe. Kabutops lunged at me. Two light screens shattered almost instantly beneath its scythe-like arms, the razor-sharp blades missing my throat by mere centimeters. Fuck this. I vanished with extreme speed. Lightning crackled around my fist as I reappeared beside the fossil Pokémon, driving a lightning punch straight into its ribs. The impact slammed Kabutops into the floor hard enough to splinter the wooden planks. Ventis was no slower. She thrust out her wand and activated a field of crackling static around herself. Any attempt to strike her in melee would now electrocute the attacker. All of this happened in less than 2 seconds. Then the room exploded into chaos. Jolteon sprang awake in a shower of sparks. Primarina gathered water. Noctowl flared his wings. The door to our room didn't even open. It exploded inward. The Aura Knight burst through the shattered wood with murder in his eyes. The assassin instantly realized the attack had failed. Without hesitation, he dove toward the window. Thoom! He rebounded violently. A triple-layered barrier shimmered into existence around the room. Ventis. She hadn't cast it now. She had prepared it before going to sleep. Nothing was getting in. Nothing was getting out. I wanted to help capture the assassin. Instead, thud! Kabutops drove both feet into my solar plexus with a brutal double kick. The air exploded from my lungs. Before I could recover, a water pulse, a sphere of spinning water, struck me square in the face. The world lurched sideways. Everything spun. My balance vanished. Fine. If I couldn't see straight, I just hit everything in front of me. Lightning surged through my arm once more. I poured everything I had left into a final lightning punch. Ventis instinctively did the same through our bond. The world blurred. The punch landed. This time, something gave way, unlike anything before. Kabutops shuddered violently. Its weight suddenly collapsed onto my outstretched arm. The room slowly stopped spinning. I blinked, then looked down. Blood, dark, warm blood, coated my paw. There was a hole. Right through Kabutops' chest. My breath caught. I stared without understanding. This wasn't fainting. This wasn't a battle ending. I'd killed it. Behind me, the assassin was already pinned to the floor by the Aura Knight, completely overpowered. I slowly turned toward the others. My stomach lurched. The contents of my dinner hit the floor before I could stop it. I'd seen death since coming to this world. But I'd never killed anyone myself. I had always tried not to. Pokémon moves were terrifyingly powerful, especially when I was supercharged by a human mage. Only now did I realize something. I'd always been holding back. Whether it was my flames or my physical attacks, I had always instinctively pulled my punches. I had never truly gone all out. Until now. Until our lives were on the line. Did I regret it? The answer was complicated. Kabutops had worn a collar. He hadn't chosen to attack me. He had been ordered to kill me. Could I have removed his collar somehow? Could I have saved him? I honestly didn't know. Everything had happened so fast. There hadn't been time to think. I'd acted purely on instinct. I killed him. I stared down at my paw. It had already been cleaned. Ventis had used her cleaning spell on both my fur and the room, washing away every trace of blood. Yet, I could still feel it. My paw trembled. It had been over an hour since the attack, yet my thoughts refused to slow. My stomach still churned, even though there was nothing left to throw up. I felt sick, sad, relieved that we had survived, furious at whoever had sent an assassin after us. Every emotion crashed together until I simply couldn't hold them back anymore. I broke. Tears streamed down my muzzle as Ventis wrapped both arms around me. She gently stroked the fur between my ears, saying nothing for a long while. Finally, she spoke in a hushed voice. "You did your best." Her hand continued to stroke my head. "Everything is all right now." I buried my face against her shoulder. The next 3 days passed quietly. The captured assassin was handed over to the local authorities when we passed through one of the larger towns, but aside from that, nothing noteworthy happened. I mostly kept to myself. I knew it was stupid not to talk. I simply couldn't. Primarina quietly hummed soft melodies whenever she sat beside me. Jolteon rarely spoke at all, choosing instead to simply lean against my side whenever we rested. Noctowl reminded me more than once that I'd save not only myself, but Ventis as well. With our soul bond, the death of one of us would have meant the death of the other. I knew they were right. It just didn't make the memory any lighter. On the fourth day, just before our carriage crested the final hill overlooking the capital, I finally broke the silence. "I'm all right." Everyone looked toward me. I took a slow breath before continuing. "If anyone threatens us again," my voice was calm, almost frighteningly so, "I won't hold back." I looked down at my paw for only a moment, before lifting my head again. This world doesn't allow us to stay weak. No one answered immediately. There wasn't really anything to say. They all understood. Ventis quietly reached over and rested a hand on my shoulder. That was enough. As the towers of the capital slowly rose beyond the hill, I realized just how much had changed over the past year. We were no longer the naive mage and curious Breakson who had nervously stepped through the academy gates. We had survived political schemes. The second year awaited us. This time, we would enter the Royal Magic Academy not as outsiders trying to find our place, but as people who already understood the cost of standing in the middle of noble politics. And we were ready. Zelia and Reginald were waiting for us with warm smiles, instantly lifting the serious mood that had lingered throughout the journey. They helped unload our luggage while I stepped into the entrance hall. Then I smelled it. Fresh pizza. How they knew we were about to arrive, I honestly didn't care. Right now, I needed my old comfort food more than ever. Without another thought, I left my suitcase beside the stairs and bolted toward the kitchen. Zelia couldn't help but laugh. "I knew you'd smell it before you saw it." I ignored the teasing, grabbed the knife, cut myself a thick slice, and immediately stuffed my face with the steaming goodness. The gooey cheese stretched with every bite, the mellow tomato sauce blended perfectly with the fresh herbs, and the crisp crust had just the right amount of crunch. My legs actually shuddered. "Oh, pizza," I mumbled between mouthfuls. "My one true love, embrace me." By the time I finally slowed down, an entire plate had disappeared. Soon the others joined in, and several pizzas later, we were all comfortably full. Since it was such a happy reunion, we decided not to tell Zelia and Reginald what had happened on the road. Instead, we shared stories from Blackhall and our time at Evelna, keeping the conversation light. By late afternoon, everyone had settled back into their rooms. I flopped onto my bed and immediately frowned. I forgot how stiff the capital's beds are. As I thought back to the wonderfully soft bed waiting for me at Evelna, I let out a quiet chuckle. For the first time in days, my mind drifted toward completely unimportant things. It felt peaceful. With that comforting thought, I closed my eyes and quietly drifted off to sleep. With a few days left before the academy opened for the new year, I decided to spend some time wandering the capital. This time, I wasn't alone. Jolteon had apparently promoted himself to my second bodyguard, so the three of us walked together. A Feraligatr, a Jolteon, and a Breakson. Honestly, we looked a little out of place. Did I care about the strange looks we got? Hell no. Ventis had also decided to retire her old academy uniform. As a second-year student, she was no longer required to wear one, and after her recent growth spurt, the old outfit barely fit anyway. Instead, she wore the elegant mage robes Pelien had given her. At 19 and a half, she was almost fully grown now. Robert, who had once been noticeably taller, was now only slightly above her height. As I turned into one of the manor's corridors, I nearly walked straight into Bishop. "Finally, we meet again," I grinned. "So Robert managed to rescue you from the capital manor?" "It wasn't that bad," Bishop shrugged. "I missed him, certainly, but he decided to leave me here with the other Pokémon from the capital manor." "Huh, I never really met them," I admitted. "The only time I'd been there was during Ventis's birthday celebration. You'll have to introduce me next time." Bishop gave a simple nod before continuing toward Robert's study, a room that had practically been surrendered to books. Shelves lined every wall, with more stacks slowly invading the floor. So many books. Just as I continued down the corridor, I heard Zelia's voice coming from Ventis's room. "If you keep fidgeting like that, I'll never get your hair right." Curious, I peeked inside. Ventis stood before the mirror wearing an elegant ballroom dress, while Zelia carefully adjusted the final strands of her purple hair. "Huh?" I asked through our bond. "What's the occasion?" "Sorry, I didn't want to bother you," she replied. "Besides, it's a non-Pokémon event. Robert and I are attending a small ball tonight." "Sheesh." I rolled my eyes. "And here I thought you hated those." "I did." She smiled, that goofy little smile that always appeared whenever Robert was involved. "But with good company, I'm sure it'll be much more enjoyable." "Sure," I smirked. "Don't come crying to me when those shoes destroy your toes." Ventis laughed, earning a mock scolding look from Zelia as she tried to keep her hair in place. I simply waved a paw and continued down the hallway, leaving the two of them to finish getting ready. The ballroom below was alive with music and laughter. Crystal chandeliers bathed the polished floor in warm light, while noble couples drifted gracefully from one dance to the next. From the second-floor gallery, two men watched the festivities in silence. One held a glass of dark wine. The other kept both hands clasped behind his back. Marquis Dante Ironhill finally broke the silence. "Your Grace." Duke Leopold Haxon didn't take his eyes off the dancers below. "Marquis." Dante's gaze settled on a familiar couple. Ventis Balatoa and Robert moved together surprisingly well. The young woman's earlier awkwardness at noble gatherings had all but disappeared over the past year. "You've become impatient." Leopold's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course." Dante let the answer hang for a moment before continuing. "The incident on the southern road was unfortunate. I trust those responsible have already answered for their failure." "They have." Moments passed by. Dante slowly exhaled. "With respect, Your Grace, repeated failures tend to attract unwanted attention." Leopold finally looked at him. "You presume much." "I observe much." Leopold returned his attention to the ballroom. "That girl has become a political inconvenience beyond reason. A commoner should not stand beside princes, archmages, and kings, as though she belongs there." Dante's eyes narrowed, ever so slightly. "No, that wasn't the real reason. The Duke couldn't care less about Ventis's birth. He cared that County Velna had become untouchable because of her. For years, House Haxon had slowly tightened the noose around the county. Political favors, trade pressure, influence at court, all of it had unraveled within a single year. The king now watched Velna. The archmage visited it. The second prince openly associated with its people. Touching the count had become impossible, and it all traced back to one purple-haired girl and one strange Brakeson. "Even so," Dante said carefully, choosing every word, "there are gentler methods. You suggest blackmail. I suggest options." The Duke considered that. "And if she refuses?" Dante didn't answer immediately. "There are always additional moves after diplomacy fails." Leopold allowed himself the faintest smile. "For a military man, you play an interesting game of politics. I merely prefer victories that don't invite questions." The Duke nodded once. The music below reached its finale as applause echoed through the ballroom. Leopold drained the last of his wine before handing the empty glass to a passing servant. "Very well." He turned toward the corridor. "I believe." He paused just long enough for Dante to wonder which path the Duke had chosen. "It is time we explored a different approach." Without another word, Leopold disappeared into the hallway. Dante remained at the railing, watching Ventis laugh, as Robert whispered something that made her smile. He hated this. Young people full of life, drawn into political games they barely understood. Dante considered himself a man of honor, and the Duke's methods made the wine in his glass taste like ash. Ventis returned to her room, tired beyond reason, her ankles burning but her heart light. Despite it all, she was happy. Robert was exactly her type. The young man wasn't some silver-tongued charmer. If anything, he could be a little awkward at times, and he never tried to embellish his feelings or hide behind flowery words. Whatever he showed came straight from the heart, honest and without sugarcoating. A rarity among nobles, as she'd come to learn. Meanwhile, I was downstairs in the kitchen, hard at work on my fourth attempt at a soufflé. The stupid thing simply refused to come out as beautifully as I remembered. Zelia happily helped me dispose of every failed attempt, and by nightfall both of us were stuffed. I let out a frustrated snort before tossing the last, slightly lopsided soufflé to Jolteon. He couldn't have cared less whether it was perfect. It was sweet and warm. That was all that mattered to him. The next day was dedicated entirely to team building, as we hosted a lovely little garden party. Zelia and I did our best to recreate foods and sweets from my memories, while Reginald proudly presented several tins of imported tea from the southern leaf kingdom of Cunaria. Apparently, Cunaria was an exceptionally closed-off nation. They rarely traded with the outside world, and the last war involving them had taken place over 600 years ago. I found myself genuinely curious about their culture. From what I'd learned, the kingdom was covered in tropical forests and vast swamps. Invading such a place sounded idiotic at best. The land itself would likely destroy an army long before the defenders had to lift a finger. Tea, however, was one of Cunaria's greatest specialties. After tasting it, I could understand why. It was remarkably smooth, rich without being bitter, and lacked the dry aftertaste common in Vermont's teas. "Oh, this is lovely." Ventis beamed after taking a careful sip of the bright ruby-red brew. Even I, with my thoroughly modern taste buds, had to admit it was premium tea. Now if only I had a bit of sugar to sweeten it to my liking. I chuckled as I casually dropped a sugar cube into my cup. Across the table, Reginald looked positively horrified. The expression of a true tea purist witnessing sacrilege. I simply smiled, stirred my cup once, and took a very satisfied sip. As the day of the Academy's reopening arrived, I walked through the main gates like I owned the place. My strength wasn't just the result of a soul bond with an exceptional mage. It had been forged through relentless training, sweat, setbacks, and battles that nearly claimed our lives. I rolled my shoulders and smiled. Let the second year begin. If anyone tried to threaten us again, they would learn exactly how much we had changed.